world of cable news screaming and social media echo chambers, it's easy to lose the signal in the noise. Every day, policy is debated, votes are cast, and your tax dollars are spent. We cut through the headlines to bring you the critical context you need, focusing on what's really going on in news and politics. Welcome to the Analytical Iowan Podcast. This is your daily dose of fact-driven politics. Let's analyze today's news. Here's Eric.
We are back on the Analytical Iowan Podcast. It is Saturday, November 15th. Now, you're probably wondering, why is this podcast going up so late? Well, full transparency and truth be told, was going to record last night. Got done recording with Mike, the Rational Boomer. Was going to sit down, record my own. Said I was going to take like an hour off or so. And then I got busy doing stuff for work. Had to go help do some stuff. Not a big deal. When I got back, ended up jumping in to Trucker Tees Live and planned to, just hang out for just a little bit. Next thing I know, it's been over 2 hours and I needed to get to bed. So I went to bed. Figured I'd just get up early and record the podcast in the morning. And I did that. And this was going to be up and ready to go by about midday for all of you to enjoy. Well, Eric screwed up. And what did I do? I accidentally deleted the entire clip. Don't even know how I did it. In my haste to get everything going and get it rolling and getting it put up and all of it, somehow I deleted the entire clip, and it is gone. It's not in a trash file. I looked. I don't have a copy of it anywhere. So here I am, way later than I would ever want to be recording today's podcast, about the time I would be considering recording tomorrow's podcast, if I'm being honest. And I'm recording today's podcast over again. I hope it's just every bit as good as what I did before, but I couldn't tell you because I don't operate with a script. So hopefully I cover everything I meant to cover. We're going to get into it and, see where we go. And hopefully this time I don't end up doing something stupid like deleting it by mistake. So let's get into the podcast. All right. Now, we have the Epstein emails, and these are emails that were turned over to the House Oversight Committee, not by the DOJ, but by the Epstein estate itself. They answered a subpoena from Congress and turned these emails over. Now, none of these are good for Donald Trump. There's a lot of things coming out. And we've been talking about things that have come up. Okay? Now, one of the questions we have to answer is, what the hell's wrong with our media? But not just our media. Why didn't anybody around Donald Trump come out and blow the whistle during his first administration? We are finding out that during Donald Trump's first administration, while he was the sitting president, he had Thanksgiving dinner with Jeffrey Epstein in 2017, I believe. Now, how did somebody with the criminal background like Jeffrey Epstein, who was accused of doing the things Epstein is accused of doing, how did he get that close to Donald Trump that he was able to have Thanksgiving dinner with Donald Trump, other than the people around him bent a knee and said, yeah, that's not a big deal. Donald Trump wants to have a known child sex trafficker around for Thanksgiving. Oh, this is normal. I mean, what would they have said if that was Barack Obama or Joe Biden? They would have lost their minds. So the people around him didn't say anything. They didn't stop it. They didn't do anything. But then how come, usually the president's actions are pretty well documented by the media. They're always hoping to scoop out another network. They're always looking for an angle. How come none of them are reporting on it? Is there a reason they didn't cover it? Now, there's always a chance that what's in these files maybe isn't 100% true. Maybe he didn't spend Thanksgiving there. But based on reactions of what we are seeing from people to the things that are in the files, I believe what's here is legit. Now, how did Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein manage to pull that off? That's going to come out in the coming days and weeks and months as more and more information is released from the Epstein files and the Epstein estate and by the House Oversight Committee. Now, I never expected the Republican led House Oversight Committee to be releasing this information. Remember, it's a Republican led House investigation. I thought for sure they would end up covering for Donald Trump. They would only release things that are bad for Democrats. But they're not doing that. Now, some of the stuff they're releasing, it's in response to things that Democrats are leaking. They're saying, well, you're taking these emails out of context, or you're taking these files out of context, or you're only showing certain bits and pieces that make Donald Trump look bad. The fact that Donald Trump is mentioned at all in some of the context that we are seeing is bad. Now, some of the emails clearly say Donald Trump knew about the girls and what was going on, which we kind of already knew that. I mean, the suspicion is that Donald Trump was involved in the trafficking ring. Maybe not as a main person, but as a client. And supposedly there are pictures in there in the entirety of the evidence that Epstein has somewhere of Donald Trump with topless underage girls. That in itself would be damning. But something else came out in these emails that seemed to be even more damning. And you've probably heard about this by now because, well, I'm re-recording this podcast. But it was the biggest thing yesterday to come out, really, is that one of the emails from, I believe it was Epstein to his brother. It might have been from the brother to Jeffrey Epstein. Either way, they asked if Vladimir Putin has pictures with Donald Trump going down on Bubba. Now, typically when you think of somebody nicknamed Bubba, you think of, a dude, right? Usually some big country dude. Well, I didn't know this until this information came out. And in part, I think it's because he hasn't been politically relevant. He's kind of stayed under the radar. But supposedly, Bill Clinton's nickname, or one of them, has always been Bubba. So there was a lot of speculation that there are pictures of Donald Trump pulling a Monica Lewinsky on Bill Clinton. And the jokes that I am seeing all over social media have got to be driving Donald Trump insane. He very much cares about appearances and what people think of him. And the simple fact of this being out there is going to shake him. He doesn't want to be connected to anything with the Epstein files. And now, if there is a link between him and this Bubba, and Bubba ends up being Clinton, this isn't something that he is going to be able to come back from. He doesn't want that connection. He's not going to be able to spin, divert, distract, or get away from it. And the sad thing is, for the most of us that are on the Democratic side, we don't care that if he was with a consenting Bill Clinton and they were two adults doing whatever they wanted to do. If Bill Clinton was Bubba. Again, we're not sure that it is. Now, supposedly, Epstein's brother Mark has said, no, Bubba isn't Bill Clinton, but he hasn't said who Bubba is yet. So, but it doesn't matter, right? This image is out there now. Donald Trump doesn't like it, and he's embarrassed, he's ashamed, whatever the case may be. But people on the left don't care. If that is who he is, cool. You know what? Great. The problem we have with it is the hypocrisy from people on the right. They're trying to do all sorts of things to strip away protections for the LGBTQ community, things like that. And then you have Donald Trump, who may potentially, based on what we're seeing in the email and what them saying what they have, there may be something that proves that Donald Trump is bi. And he is going to be trying to downplay this and get away from it or whatever. and we don't really care. Problem is, it's the hypocrisy, right? And that's the problem with Republicans. You've got several members of the Republican Party in Congress who are suspected to be gay or bi, and we don't really care. It's the fact that they are doing and enacting policies that are so far anti their own groups that it's not funny. It's the hypocrisy that we can't stand. Now, couple thoughts with this whole thing involving Bubba. Now, this is something I had thought of while sitting in Trucker Tees Live last night. Somebody said something about Putin having these pictures or whatever, and I got me thinking. Well, if it's not Bill Clinton, and they asked, like, well, what would Putin be doing with these pictures other than blackmail? Well, who could Bubba be? Maybe. Remember during the campaign, Donald Trump stopped his campaigning to turn around and have this ramble where he went on about being in the locker room with Arnold Palmer and how manly he was and how well endowed he was and all of that. Maybe Arnold Palmer was Bubba because of just thinking about the way Donald Trump was talking about fondly remembering Arnold Palmer and his looks, etc., and being manly and being well endowed, all of that. Well, that would be embarrassing for Donald Trump. The other thought I came up with was, well, why would Putin have the pictures? Unless, what if Bubba is the nickname for, Vladimir Putin's member? And there's pictures of Donald Trump doing things to Vladimir Putin. That would be embarrassing. That would really explain potentially Donald Trump and his attitude and things toward Vladimir Putin. Now, one of the things with this whole Epstein problem and with the mentioning of Bubba and all of this might mean that the business empire that Epstein had, and he built it all on trafficking young underage girls and the clientele that would want them for the activities that they were doing. Okay, he made money doing that, but the real way he probably made his money was in the blackmail. Okay, he gets somebody in a compromised position like that, especially somebody well known. Now, Donald Trump, at the time all of the Epstein things were going on, he was more of an outsider. He was not well liked in financial circles because of how he handled his business practices. Remember, he made his money in real estate and business development and things, and he has bankrupted a lot of companies. And one of the things we find out is as he bankrupts these companies, there's usually a golden parachute for Donald Trump, and he makes out like a bandit while the company underneath him folds and the people that were working for him aren't getting paid. The business collapses and they no longer have jobs, etc. He wasn't well liked in some circles for his business practices, etc., and for not paying his contractors for doing work, or he would tie them up in litigation until they ultimately either went out of business or they settled on fractions of pennies on the dollar for everything that he owed. It was, he wasn't well liked, but he was connected enough to be in this kind of a social circle with Epstein. And you get somebody like that who has money in a compromising position. You've got some influence, you've got some power, and potentially Epstein's making some money on the deal. You can blackmail him because Donald Trump always cared about his appearance and how people perceived him and all of that. So he would do anything probably to keep things like that hidden. And if there's more to it than just the blackmail for dealing things with underage kids, like if there was, apparently a party or something, some event anyway, where Donald Trump was with somebody called Bubba and did something to Bubba, that image gets out, Donald Trump would be devastated, right? So Donald Trump was probably paying Epstein to keep it quiet. But now we find out maybe Putin has these images. Well, now what is Donald Trump doing? What kind of favors is he doing to Putin? And not favors like that, although maybe. Um, Remember during his first term, he met with Vladimir Putin at one point in a closed room with no interpreters and no staff around, and they had a meeting. We don't know what was discussed. There was no record of the meeting other than it happening. So we don't know what's going on there. But potentially could Vladimir Putin, if these pictures exist and he has access to them, what could he get out of Donald Trump? What could he get Donald Trump to give him? Maybe it would be like what's going on in Ukraine right now. Donald Trump keeps saying, well, to Zelensky, he goes back and forth. Specifically, after talking to Vladimir Putin, he goes back to Zelensky. Well, you should give in. You should give Russia whatever they want, or they're going to annihilate you. So could it be that uh, every time Donald Trump talks to Putin, Putin's like, "Hey, I got that picture of you and Bubba. You know, you keep putting pressure on Zelensky. If you turn against me, I'm releasing it." I mean, it could happen. Now, this could end up being the kind of story that blows up, where we find out that there are multiple leaders in multiple countries that are being blackmailed by this country and that country, and who knows who has what on who. This could end up being a huge, huge international story. Now, as it all goes, this is embarrassing to Donald Trump. The thought of him being with some dude named Bubba is not something that he wants out there, but it's out there in the narrative now. Now, his strategy to talk about it is to not talk about it. He was answering questions from reporters on Air Force One, and this reporter asked him the type of question they should have been asking him all the way back in 2015 when he was running for president, going into 2016 in the primaries, when he just started getting into politics. If they would have put, some pressure on him way back then, he wouldn't be in the position he's in now. So what did this reporter ask? Well, the reporter started to ask, well, Donald, Mr. President, I think is what they said, if the Epstein files are going to exonerate you, why don't you release them? Or that's where the question was going anyway. And Donald Trump just yelled, "Quiet, quiet," and then moved on to the next reporter, because that's all he's got. He doesn't have a winning strategy when it comes to the Epstein files. He's just trying to ignore it, and he's hoping it's going to go away. Now, what's going to happen with these Epstein files? Well, we are hearing that it could be as early as Wednesday. They are going to hold a vote in the House of Representatives. Okay. And this is on the discharge petition. And we are slowly hearing that more and more Republicans are coming out publicly saying, I'm going to vote in favor of releasing the Epstein files. Why would they do that? Well, they don't want to answer their constituents. They don't want to answer their voters. Okay, they have been telling their voters for years that the only people in the Epstein files are going to be Democrats. It's going to be left-leaning people, and they're the only ones who would do these horrible things to children. Okay, now, that being said, they say all that. Then it comes out that there are people like the sitting president potentially connected to Jeffrey Epstein. And Donald Trump doesn't even want us to know that him and Epstein were friends at all. He's trying to rewrite history, and it's not working. So Donald Trump is going to be watching this vote very closely. Now, Mike Johnson is not able to prevent the vote. Some people are suggesting that he is going to say something like, well, you want the ACA subsidies passed. You guys, a few of you scratch your names off that discharge petition and we won't hold the vote. But now that they've got the 218, we're hearing more Republicans sign on board. So what could happen here? Well, multiple things. First of all, what happens when 100 Republicans, and that is one of the numbers that is being floated by some reports by some news outlets. They're saying it could be up to 100 Republicans that break with the administration, that break with the Republican line of not releasing the Epstein files. Okay, so that would mean that it passes the House with like 318. Well, they only need 290 to be in a veto-proof majority. They're well past that. Then it goes to the Senate. Okay, now all eyes would be on the Senate to actually pass it. Now, does it pass the Senate? I don't know. I don't know what they do with it. However, with that kind of pressure being there, it is entirely possible that the Republicans in the Senate say, you know what, we got to hold this for a vote. Now, they bring it up for a vote, and they get, they would probably need 60 minimum to get to around the filibuster. And we know all about the filibuster because of the government shutdown deal. But is it possible they pass it with a veto-proof majority? Yeah, it is. Because of the public pressure, with them looking at everything going on and going, we don't want to answer our voters either. Oh shit, we're fucked. If we vote to keep these Epstein files hidden, we're screwed. So they may vote to release the files. Now, what happens when the House and the Senate both pass it? It goes to Trump's desk for a signature, right? Well, he's not going to sign it. We know he's not going to sign it because that's who Donald Trump is. He doesn't want these things seeing the light of day. There is no way you are going to be able to convince Donald Trump to release the Epstein files. You're just not. So he's going to veto it. Now, again, if they get 100 Republicans passing it in the House of Representatives, they're at 280. They're well past the 290 mark to override a veto. And if they get over 67 senators signing off on it, and once he vetoes it and the public outcry gets even louder, even more are probably going to consider breaking ranks. Now, what could happen? If he vetoes it, could they pass it around his veto? Yes, but there's time frames. Okay, there's a thing called a pocket veto, and he's not going to be able to use a pocket veto here in this case because Congress has pretty much put a kibosh to pocket vetoes. How'd they do that? Well, what is a pocket veto is a good place to start. They turn around. Presidents have 10 days from the date Congress passes a law to sign it. If they do not sign it, it becomes law, as if they had signed it. And that was put into place to prevent presidents from doing exactly what people like Mitch McConnell like to do, and that's let legislation just pile up on their desk and do nothing and ignore it. Because that's what Donald Trump would do with these Epstein files, is he would ignore it. So what happens when he vetoes it? Well, if the president vetoes it, it goes back to Congress, and they have a chance to pass it around his veto. Now, we were just saying he could have a veto-proof majority in the House of Representatives already. So it goes back to the House. They could pass it. Well, we're coming up to the holidays. What happens if they're out for their Thanksgiving break? Well, see, they don't actually go on recess. We've talked about it before. They do what's called a pro forma session. They turn around, and every 3 days they have a member of Congress of the majority party, and both parties do this. This is not just a Republican thing or a Democrat thing. They both do it because by staying in session like this, it changes the rules and it puts some limits on what the president can do in regards to both houses. So about every 3 days, you would have somebody, and I'm going to pick on Marjorie Taylor Greene for a minute, only because she's not the Speaker of the House right now. So Mike Johnson would say, okay, Marjorie, we're going home for Thanksgiving. Call us into session in 3 days and gavel us out. They would hold what's called a pro forma session. So with Marjorie Taylor Greene being the selected person, she would show up, gavel in like normal, open the House like normal, and then say, presuming that everybody is here, if there are no objections, we'll be back. We're going to adjourn for 3 days. We will be back in 3 days. Why 3 days? Well, there was a Supreme Court case a while back I believe it was during the Bush administration, but I could be wrong about that. The George W. Bush administration, saying that short breaks, like, less than a week, are not enough for them to be considered adjourned because it changes how things work in regards to presidential powers and his having to respond to things that Congress does. And like this case, where uh, if Congress wouldn't be there and they would be out and they would be adjourned when he vetoes this bill, it limits what they can do and how long they have to respond to it and how they have to override his veto. Okay. So they don't go out for full weeks anymore. They haven't since, I believe it was the George W. Bush administration. They just take these every 3 days. They hold a pro forma session, which means somebody would be there when the veto happens to call Mike Johnson and say, "Hey, we got the veto. Bring us back into session." Now, would Mike Johnson bring the House back into session? Possibly. Why? Well, even though he's probably going to vote against the Epstein files, having that many members of his own party break rank and vote with Democrats to pass it to where they have a veto proof majority, he knows how bad it's going to look for him and other members of his party. And they're starting to worry about the midterms. Okay. They're getting terrified of losing the House in the midterms. And that's probably a foregone conclusion. I think they could lose the House by 40 or 50 seats. And Democrats, if they play their cards right, could have major pickups. But because they're worried about losing their seats, he could bring the House back into session to hold this vote. And they only have so many days in which they can do that, or they would have to pass it around his veto a second time because they would have to bring it in as a new piece of legislation, and they would turn around, kick it back to his desk again, assuming everybody who voted on it the first time would vote on it a second time. And then they turn around and say, okay, he vetoes it then the second time, they could pass it around his veto. All Donald Trump would be doing is delaying the inevitable, especially if it passes with a veto proof majority. Okay. So, how could this play out? Well, one of the ways it could play out potentially is I know Republicans are probably looking at what they can do post Donald Trump. And one of the things they're looking at is moving on to JD Vance. Now, JD Vance was sitting down with Fox News a while back, and he said on Fox News that after the midterms, he is going to have a conversation with Donald Trump about running for 2028 probably to get Trump's endorsement. Okay. They're already looking at it. Well, they could use the outcry over the Epstein files as enough and as evidence of criminality on the part of Donald Trump as a way to get away from Donald Trump. Now, the Epstein files has been a huge thing for the MAGA movement. Like I said earlier, they are wanting all of the proof that it's nothing but Democrats. Now, some of them will not believe that Donald Trump is just naturally in the Epstein files, that he's there because of everything. Some of them will believe that it was a plant. But being connected to Epstein might be enough that at least certain members or enough of the MAGA movement, when it comes to voting, would be willing to be forgiving to Republicans and still vote for him if they turn on Donald Trump. See, that's the reason they haven't turned on him yet. They still think he has political capital. So they're trying to stay in his good graces, and they want to do the best they can in the midterms. But like I said earlier, they may end up losing the House by 40 to 50 seats. So if they're worried about losing the House and maybe the Senate with Donald Trump, could they go ahead and decide to move on and move away from Donald Trump? Now, one of the things that has been brought up and suggested is that the Republicans could offer Donald Trump a deal. I don't know that his ego would let him take this deal unless it came with a guarantee of a pardon from J.D. Vance. And what was the deal? That they offer him basically the same thing that Nixon got. They go up to him and said, "Hey, look, Donnie, you vetoed the Epstein files. We know you're in it. This isn't a good look for you. This isn't anything you need to be worried about. We need you out of the way. You need to resign. And if you do not resign, we will remove you." What? Could they do it? Yeah. Are they going to? Who knows? But would his uh, ego allow him to resign in disgrace? Probably not, unless it came with a pardon, a way out, an escape hatch. And if he thinks he's getting away from it and nothing is going to hurt him on the backside, maybe then they go and he accepts that kind of a deal. But otherwise, they'd have to impeach and remove him. Would they? Maybe. We know one member of Congress, ever since the day she became a member of Congress, has been trying to impeach somebody. I think she's brought up articles of impeachment 3 or 4 times against Joe Biden, against a couple of judges once or twice, and that's Marjorie Taylor Greene. Now, Marjorie Taylor Greene is on the outs with MAGA. Why? Well, she's on the outs with MAGA, and Donald Trump came out and said, we're not going to support her anymore. That if a good challenger came up to primary her in her district, that he would back the challenger. Why? Well, because she turned on him on the Epstein files. Donald Trump only keeps people around that he views as loyal, and she's not loyal anymore. So he walked away from her. But why is she walking away? Why is she starting to sound rational? Well, I believe it was when Herschel Walker ran for Senate in Georgia. She wanted to run for that seat, and they told her no, that she was better off staying in her district. Now, she's got aspirations of moving up the political hierarchy and, winning statewide races, whether it be senator, governor, maybe even some people are saying she may want to run for president. Now, I don't think she could ever win in a run for president because I don't think she could get any Democrats to vote for her. But all that being said, she's on the outside. And now Donald Trump has turned his back on her, saying, yeah, if there's a primary challenger, we're going to primary her. What? So she's got no reason to be loyal to Donald Trump. Maybe she's the one who leads the charge, trying to reform and salvage what's left of the Republican Party before Donald Trump can burn it all to the ground. So do they impeach and remove him? Maybe. Maybe. It's possible. But, they could turn around and turn on Donald Trump, and he wouldn't know how to act because he's not used to them saying no, to them saying, we're moving on beyond you. He hasn't thought about the Republican Party not needing him. I guarantee it. But they could use his connection to Epstein as a good enough reason to impeach and remove Donald Trump or to force him to resign and potentially use it as a way to keep MAGA happy and not risk losing that big chunk of MAGA voters that potentially would never turn out to vote for a Republican ever again, or would try to primary out all of the sitting members of Congress or whatever. Because as we talk about all the time, politicians love their own power. And if they're more worried about getting reelected and answering to their voters than they are about pleasing Donald Trump at this point. They've decided that, if we do get 100 members of the House voting against Donald Trump and in favor of releasing the Epstein files, this is going to send a clear signal that the Republican Party is getting ready to move on from Donald Trump. Now, realistically, the time they should have moved away from Donald Trump was all the way back in 2021 during his second impeachment. But they didn't. Why? Well, you can blame Mitch McConnell and a very ineffective Merrick Garland. So you might remember Donald Trump gets impeached for January 6th. And politically speaking, they moved very, very quickly when it came to impeaching Donald Trump the second time. Normally it takes months, and they didn't have months. They were up against the clock trying to make it happen before he was out of office. Okay. Well, they just get it in because they only had 2 weeks, and not even 2 weeks to get it done. They get it in. They take it over to the Senate for trial, and they get to the end of the trial, and Mitch McConnell goes after he votes to acquit. Well, I would have voted to convict, but it's a moot point. He's out of office. And he did have kind of a point, but he said now it's a criminal matter. The criminal justice system should handle Donald Trump. Okay, but then you had Merrick Garland. Merrick Garland comes around, looks at the situation. Sure, they went after all the low-level people, but they didn't go after anybody that was in the Congress. No members of the House, no senators. They didn't go after Donald Trump or any of his advisors. None of those high-ranking people had any sort of an investigation until Jack Smith gets involved. Well, with all of that being said, Merrick Garland said basically it's a political problem. And he said, well, they should have handled it with impeachment. So I don't want to look too political, and I'm not going to deal with it. It's effectively how he handled it. But see, the Republicans wanted the Democrats to clean up their mess, and they just didn't do it. So here we are. Now we're still dealing with Donald Trump. I think especially if it's Epstein related, if Donald Trump gets impeached and removed, or if he voluntarily resigns with the promise of a pardon, not that I'm worried about J.D. Vance winning a term on his own anyway, but I think if he were to pardon Donald Trump specifically for anything connected to Epstein, I think that would be the end of his political career, guaranteed, above and beyond how bad he's going to do as president. Now, why might Republicans be willing, beyond the appearance of being connected to Epstein, why would they be willing to turn on Donald Trump? Well, that has to do with making J.D. Vance out to be a sympathetic person. Now, what am I talking about? Well, J.D. Vance is not very well liked, not even with MAGA. Okay. Now, if they get their butts kicked in the midterms, or maybe they decide to move on Donald Trump ahead of the midterms, I can already see a campaign strategy forming for the Republicans saying, okay, well, we just got rid of Donald Trump. J.D. Vance is new at the job. We got the midterms here. Well, you should give us another 2 years of being in charge so J.D. Vance can actually get to work and get things done and start fixing this country. And that will work with a portion of this country. I don't know how big of a group, but there will be some people who will go, yeah, that makes sense, and vote for Republicans again. We've seen what Republicans can do when they're in charge. They don't do fuck all. They shut the government down. They don't negotiate. They strong arm. Now, if it's after the midterms and they've already lost the House and the Senate, again, their reelection campaign would be hinging on the idea of J.D. Vance not having a full term and having to deal with a democratically controlled House and Senate. Not a good look. They could say, hey, he didn't get a full term. He had to deal with the Democrats. He couldn't pass anything. You need to give him another term. Again, trying to make him sympathetic. Just thinking about ways they could try to turn this here. It is entirely possible that Republicans turn on Donald Trump trying to secure their political future. I don't think it's going to work, but Donald Trump can't run again, and he is poised to potentially cost them the House and maybe the Senate. Now, there's at least 4 seats in which I think they could be highly competitive, maybe as many as 6. Democrats need to pick up 4 seats and to control the Senate. And I think we have to really focus on getting them the Senate because of something that could happen. Okay? Even assuming Donald Trump makes it to the end of his term, which I do not think is likely, his health is not going to hold out. But if he makes it to the end of his term, he potentially could have 2 Supreme Court justices that decide to resign, especially if it looks like it's going to be a blue wave and a blue bloodbath in the midterms, that being Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito. Well, if you have Democrats in the Senate and they have control, they're not going to be able to push through somebody like Aileen Cannon or some other far-right Donald Trump sycophant who is sitting there would just be a yes man and give Donald Trump whatever he wants. The Democrats would hold the line. Now, that's very important. That's one of the reasons we need the Senate back. Now, one of the things this administration is looking at doing, and I don't know when the original proposed rule that came out during the Biden administration was going to take effect or if it had already started, but that they're rolling back, is there was a rule put forward by Donald Trump and his transportation secretary that was going to require airlines to pay passengers if their flight was delayed above and beyond so long, like $300 for up to so many hours. And then anything over that was going to be like $700, and it was going to be paid day of. Because, if you're flying and you've got a connecting flight, sure, you may have a layover. But if your flight is too late, you may not get into your connecting flight's airport till after your connecting flight has already taken off. They're not going to sit around and wait for you because your flight was late. They're still going to take off. They've got a schedule to keep. They've got to get that plane to wherever they're going to go. And this administration was going to try, or the Biden administration would rather try to get things more fair for airline passengers and force these airlines to do a better job of not having massive delays. Well, we were looking at major delays due to no air traffic controllers because of the government shutdown, et cetera. And we're going into the holiday season. And now they come out and said, yeah, we're going to roll that rule back. And I don't know for sure that it had gone into full effect or if it was going to be coming up. But either way, this administration said, yeah, we're not going to do that. We don't want, it's going to be too harsh for airlines to have to actually deal with it. So they're siding with big business again. Surprise, surprise, Republicans siding with big business. But they are. They're saying, okay, we want you guys to be able to do whatever you're going to do. And so what if people miss their connecting flights and have to rebook and pay missed flight fees and all sorts of things? It's ridiculous, but that's where this administration sits at. And they're trying to roll back anything and everything that would help anybody. One of the other things they came out with and they had said is that when it comes to food, okay, we were just talking through the entirety of the government shutdown about SNAP benefits and about people not having access to their monthly SNAP and this and that. Well, the administration came out and said everybody who is on SNAP needs to reapply, except it doesn't work that way. SNAP is not entirely a federal program, and in part because it works different state to state. Now, every state administers their own SNAP program, and they have different criteria for when and why and how you have to end up reapplying. But Donald Trump says everybody needs to reapply. Everybody needs to reapply. And they're doing it under the guise of preventing fraud. That's always their go-to. But we've been hearing about food stamp fraud for decades. I remember hearing about it, not that I entirely understood what was going on, but I remember hearing when I was a kid in the 80s and early 90s, news stories talking about fraud in the food stamp program and all of this. And they've done a pretty good job of actually combating fraud already. One of the biggest things that they did was have it go to a card. Okay, why? How did that combat fraud? Well, you need the PIN number, you need the physical card, and you have to go in, swipe the card at the store, put in your PIN to get access to it, and you can only spend so much. And now, with the way they do it, the stores get their money automatically. They don't have to wait for the paper food stamps to clear and get a check 2 months later or once every 3 months or whatever the policy was, however it worked at the time. Different, states had different things on it. By putting it on a card, you are forcing people to, account for it. You're making it better for them because now they don't have to carry a book that's easily identifiable and they don't get picked on. I mean, if you're standing in line with somebody who pays for a bunch of food and it's all food and they run a card, unless you happen to look at the card and you know what you're looking for as far as what the design is and stuff, you're not going to think twice about that. But one of the ways that they eliminated fraud and abuse in that program is something that certain people used to do. Is when it was the paper food stamps, you would have people come in to a store and they would come in and buy, say, a 19-cent banana or whatever it was with $1 food stamp. And because there was no way to give food stamp change in denominations less than $1, they would give them physical change back. And then people would come in, some, not all, would come in and say, here you go, here's $3 in change or $4, whatever it was, because cigarettes were not nearly as expensive as they are now. And you could get a pack of smokes or you could get a 6-pack of beer or whatever it was. Maybe, and some people weren't even doing it for alcohol and cigarettes. Some people were doing that just to be able to afford essentials, things that aren't covered by food stamps, like toilet paper or shampoo or whatever the case may be. Doesn't matter. But that technically was fraud. And they already cracked down on a bunch of it. But that's what they're saying is everybody's got to reapply. The other fraud thing that disappeared because of going to the cards, and I know here just in my town, and a bar that doesn't exist anymore, and I heard this story from somebody I trust. Again, this is hearsay, but I trust the source, is that there was a bar here in town where what people were doing when it was still paper food stamps is they would come in with their food stamp book and they would basically be able to trade their food stamps for 50 cents on the dollar and get alcohol. And then the bar owner was actually using the food stamps to go buy food to resupply the restaurant side of the bar. Now got caught and had a whole bunch of fines and stuff. I guess it was a big scandal when it all broke because it was somebody they wouldn't think about doing that. Okay. But they want y'all to reapply. Now, I did a video talking about how we had somebody that worked for me and they had to reapply. And when they would come up to reapply, they would get less hours. And somebody in the comments, a Trump supporter, a MAGA, said, well, you just defined fraud. And what I was talking about is we had a guy that worked for me. He was staring at how much he got a month in food stamp benefit, how much he got in medical assistance, and all of the other assistance and benefits that he got. Okay. And he did the math on where he was at. And he was going to be over, and they were going to take away all of it. And when I say he was going to be over the income limit, like he wasn't going to be over by a lot. He was going to only be over by I think it was between $100 and $200 on his 3-month average. So not a lot of money, but with all of the benefits he was getting, it was going to cost him way more than the amount of the extra work. So he said, hey, boss, I got to have my hours cut back. Can't be working this many hours. Now, the initial idea you would have is that I'm talking about somebody working a full 40. But no, the company I was working for was stingy. They didn't want to give anybody benefits. And this was after the Obamacare was passed, after the Affordable Care Act, where it was required if you had part-timers working full-time hours, after so many weeks, they were required to be given access to company insurance. This place didn't want to do that. So what'd they do? Well, they were limiting part-timers to 28 hours a week year-round. And that's all he was already working. So he said, hey, you got to cut my hours back. I can work 24 a week. I mean, he wasn't cutting, it wasn't like he said, cut me back to no hours, or, it wasn't like he was already working 40 and cutting himself to 20 just to prove that he needed the money. He was only cutting it back just a little bit, just enough that he didn't lose all of the difference in what he was getting because our system is broken. Okay. The system itself is broken in that we should have more of a staggered system to where you're not punished for getting off assistance. But see, right now, the way it works is you have to come up with all of the money that would get you off of assistance immediately when you don't qualify. If you've got kids and you're getting daycare assistance because you're on the lower end of the spectrum, daycare is outrageous right now, right? How are you going to go from just qualifying to being, to getting all that assistance and saving, having the state pay for your daycare, right? To being slightly over and now having to pay for that daycare out of pocket. Well, you need to, if you get a better job, you need to get a much better job to where this is going to work. And that's what Republicans would tell you. Well, they just need to work harder. They need to get a better job. They need to work more jobs. Well, you work more jobs, that actually ruins your idea of getting out of needing daycare assistance because now you have more time that you need covered if you have kids where, you have to provide for them. Somebody has to watch them. And then, of course, Republicans don't want to give access to abortion care. So by not doing that, and they want you to have these kids, there's not an option to get off the system. But Republicans would just say, work harder, get a better job. But if everybody who got a better job was no longer working in the low pay jobs, like this guy working for the company I was talking about, where he was only working 28 hours a week. If everybody in his shoes quit working there because they found something better, the store would be in jeopardy. That business would be in jeopardy of closing down because it didn't have enough bodies to fill and do the work. Now, would they figure it out? Probably. But again, Republicans would just say, we'll find better jobs. But then they also want people in the low paid jobs to be there and do the job when they want to go frequent that business. We need to do a better job of figuring out how to, take care of people who are on assistance and who need help. This idea that everybody on it is just committing fraud is ridiculous. No, they're not. It is something we need to deal with, and we need to help more people, make sure people can afford to live, that they can afford to eat, and that they're taken care of. And Republicans don't want to do that. Democrats do. But they will lie to your face and tell you that they most certainly do support all those things, all while actively enacting policies and doing things like this by saying, well, everyone's going to have to reapply, even though states administer their own SNAP benefit things. They administer it themselves. The money comes from the federal government in the form of block grants that have to be used for food assistance. But that's where the federal control of it pretty much ends, except for the fact of the limitations of what can be used and what it can be used for. But there's workarounds, like they're doing here in Iowa. Starting in January, they passed a waiver. Governor Reynolds went to the USDA under Donald Trump. Now, if they had tried to do it under Joe Biden, and the Biden administration said, hell no. But the Trump administration said, yeah, we're going to allow it. And they're limiting what can be bought. No spices, no sugar, no flour, no baking chips, no marshmallows, no cake mixes, no pre-made bakery cakes, no cold foods from, like, if your grocery store has a deli, right? No pre-made subs, no cold dinners, no getting like a meatloaf dinner with mashed potatoes that's cold that you'd go throw in your microwave. No sugar, no pop, no tea, only 100% juice, and the list goes on. All of those things that used to be covered are now not covered under food stamps because Iowa has set up this waiver. But it only applies to Iowa. Now, if you go to Missouri or you go to Minnesota, just picking two of the states, north and south of Iowa here, their state programs don't have those waivers. So the people in their states will not be affected by those same rules. So Donald Trump is just trying to flex, and his administration is trying to flex, trying to force people to reapply or say that they need to, and they're going to see which states comply. Problem is, they don't really have to comply because states administer their own food stamp assistance programs, etc. And whatever happened to states' rights? Republicans love to scream about states' rights until it fits their narrative to have it be something coming down from the federal government and a strong central government. But that's who Republicans are. They don't care about people necessarily, and they don't care about being hypocrites. They only care about keeping their own power and actually making sure things are much easier for the very, very wealthy. And they don't care about the lower and middle classes. All right, that's going to do it for the Analytical Iowan podcast for today. I hope I did a good job bringing it back to roughly what I talked about in the one that unfortunately got deleted out way later than I ever hoped it would be. I'm going to remind you that tomorrow I am the guest over on the Rational Boomer podcast. Check it out. Mike and I break down a lot of things, specifically involving the Epstein files and Donald Trump. And of course, we've got a lot of theories. It's a great show. Hope you check that out. And I'll be back tomorrow, or, well, looking at the time it is now and when I'm going to have to record it, maybe here in as quick as a few hours, I'll be back recording the next episode of the Analytical Iowan podcast. I hope you come back and join me tomorrow because we're going to have even more to talk about because there's always stuff to talk about with this administration. So thanks for joining me. Have a good day.
That was Eric. That does it for our analysis today. If you appreciated us cutting through the noise to get to the critical context, please make sure you're subscribed to the Analytical Iowan podcast on Spotify and YouTube. We'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.